Today, we're going to talk about the biblical view of sex, marriage, and divorce, and we're going to be looking at Matthew 5:27 through 32. And this, in case you're wondering, is the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. So I don't know if you realized that when Jesus is going through this in the Sermon on the Mount, he's actually like picking off the commandments. And he's saying, this is the way you've been taught this commandment in the past, but I'm going to really explain to you what these commandments are about. The seventh commandment is, thou shalt not commit adultery. And there we see it. This is 27. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But he's going to get down to a loophole in which the Jewish people came up with to get out of marriage and to actually commit adultery. So Jesus says to them, but I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what is Jesus doing here? Is he coming up with some sort of fresh, new idea, concept? You know, he is ratcheting this up, but this is nothing new. Does anybody know what commandment looking at a woman lustfully breaks? It's one of the 10. You probably never put it in the context of this, but it is. Coveting. That's all Jesus is doing here, is he's talking about, hey, you've separated this. There is adultery, but before there's adultery, there's coveting. You covet before you commit. You look lustfully. So what Jesus is going to do here, sometimes these are called the sixth antithesis, in which he says, an antithesis is something that you've heard, but it hasn't quite been right, so I'm going to explain to you the opposite or the more correct view. You've heard it said, but now I say to you. What is going on here is Jesus is rediscipling the disciples. You remember that this is not for the masses. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't a big sermon that he gave to like thousands and thousands of people in which the people in the back can't even understand what he's saying. That's the image we get, is there's a huge crowd. It's not. Remember the text. There's a mass of people, and Jesus calls his disciples to go with him higher. And he is teaching only the disciples. He is teaching only those who are serious about following. And these men, because they were raised in a Jewish culture and have always looked to the Pharisees and to the scribes to be their teachers, Jesus is saying, you've heard them teach this. You've heard this since you were a little child. You've heard this said in regards to this commandment. But now I'm going to say to you God's intention of what God meant for these commandments. A process of rediscipling people that have been preconditioned to think a certain way, which has been incorrect. Do you all understand that? In a sense, every time we preach from this pulpit, we are discipling you, but in many cases, we're rediscipling you. Because maybe you have heard these verses wrong. Maybe you have read them wrong. And in order to understand the truth of what Jesus is saying here, you must always keep things in the context in which they were shared. Keeping the Bible in context is essential to knowing biblical truth. There's an old saying that in Sunday school, the answer to every question is Jesus. Anybody ever hear this? Well, you get a 50-50 shot of saying Jesus in a Sunday school class. But the saying goes that when it comes to theology and when it comes to understanding the deeper meaning of the scriptures, the answer to every question is context. Because we get so messed up when we pull scriptures out of context. How many people have been on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube? And again, there's all these people pulling things out of context. And when you pull something out of context, you get what's known as a pretext. And that is something that is being said that is misleading, a reason that is being put forth that is not the real intention of the scriptures. A pretext is something that is being taken out of context. And in Scripture, there are five primary contexts. There's historical, there's literary, there's social, there's theological, and then there's the immediate context, the way the people would have heard it in that day. And every time Jesus is speaking, he is speaking in the context of something. And if you read this really carefully, there's a context. When he talks about looking at a woman lustfully and committing adultery with her already in the heart, what is the context of that verse? It's all about marriage and divorce. Whoever divorces his wife, He says, you've heard it said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, so he's going to explain this whole idea of committing adultery and what it has to do with this article of divorce that they have been practicing and what they've heard from their Pharisees and their rabbis. He is going to connect the seventh commandment in historical context and theological context with another commandment, and that is, thou shalt not covet. So what does it mean to commit adultery? That is found in Exodus 20:14. Well, here it is. This is how it's explained in Leviticus 20:10. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor. So you see a married man lusting after his neighbor's wife, and they have this sexual relationship with one another. The penalty, according to Leviticus 20:10, was, let the adulterer and the adulteress be put to death. So it's serious. To commit adultery is serious. You're going to be put to death, according to Jewish law. So let me ask you a question. Do you think it was very, very important for them not to break this commandment? Yeah, if the death penalty is involved, yeah, sure. But, knowing the wickedness of the human heart, there's going to be a desire to do that. There's going to be a desire to look lustfully after women and say to themselves, I wonder if I can have this person as my wife. I mean, it wouldn't be uncommon for even some sort of crazy wife swap even in a way. I'll get rid of my wife, you get rid of yours, we'll just switch it up here. I'm just telling you about the context. Thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not commit adultery are being linked together. Thou shalt not covet is very clear. Listen to what it says here. This is Exodus 20:17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Don't start looking around. You've got a wife, don't look for another wife. There's a lot of just being content with what God has given you here. This 10th commandment, listen, this 10th commandment reveals the heart-level nature of sin. Coveting is something you do secretly and privately. You look at someone, you covet them. That's secret. And that's where Jesus is going with looking. Is like, this is going on in your heart way before you act on it. And as far as I'm concerned, you are so far in this process that you've already committed that sin. Now, in order to understand why Jesus is making such a big deal of this, you have to understand the view of marriage from a historical, social, and immediate standpoint. You've heard it said, he says, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman and lusts after her has already committed adultery in your heart. Why is he saying that? He's saying that because in this particular society, everybody's looking at everybody else and they're thinking about ways to commit adultery. So how do you do that? Well, in this particular society, the Jewish people came up with a little thing in which it was very easy to divorce your wife, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. It was very easy to lust after somebody and then make them your wife. In this Roman Greek culture, according to people like Seneca, it wasn't uncommon for a Roman woman to have been married over 10 times. Why? Because the man uses her, gets what he wants, pushes her aside. And the Jews are living in the same culture, but they can't quite do that. They can't just use a woman and push her aside, because marriage is this covenant. So they come up with something very clever, and that is called a certificate of divorce. And here's the way the certificate of divorce works. It is found in Deuteronomy 24:1. And let's read it. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, and she departs out of his house. So can you all see can you all see where the devil might be lurking in the details here? The key words here are these. She doesn't find favor in his eyes, and he found some indecency in her. What could be the indecency? Well, at the time of Jesus, there was two rabbinical camps, the Hillel camp and the Shammai camp. And both of these camps taught different things. Both of them taught that only a man could divorce. Right? It's a man thing. It's a man's role, thanks. Women aren't divorcing anybody. They're under the man, and the man's the one who's going to do. So only the man could do divorce. But here's what basically the two camps say. The Shammai camp says it's this when it says here the indecency in her is always sexual infidelity. It can only be sexual. That's the only indecency. The other camp, which was known as the Hillel camp, very liberal views. Listen to what they described and said was allowed, what the text meant by finding no favor or some indecency. They said it was anything that displeased the husband. They said it could be something like disrespect. You disrespect me, no longer do you have favor in my eyes. I consider it to be a very decent act. Hey, guess what? I can write you the article of divorce. They even brought it down to burning a meal. Matter of fact, they got real specific in the law. Here's what it says, School Hillel, right here. If a wife cooks her husband food over salted, too much salt? How about over roasting? She can be put away. But here's the biggest catcher. You know this was written by men. Men thinking about themselves, let's see, what can we say here? And here's the last one that they added, and this one gets you right here. She falls out of favor if I find somebody more attractive. So let me ask you a question based on what you know about human nature and men. Which one do you think was the most popular view? The school of Hillel or the school of Shammai? Yeah, that was dominant. Men said, yeah, we got it made. We could be just like the Romans. We just got to come up with something. And so they would. They would go to their wife and they would say to her, hey, you know what? That meal, really salty. Really salty. I mean, I had indigestion and everything. We can't go on this way. You have not found favor in my eyes. And so here's the legal document. This is actually the legal document. This is actually the bill of divorce. Very wordy. It's like written by lawyers, right? But there was one little covenant thing I want to bring your attention to. The document says that now that this guy has released her, she is now free in thy own power to marry whoever you shall please. And let no man hinder thee. I'm releasing you, but hey, don't fear. You can just go with another man and, hey, all is well with the road. And by the way, in case you're wondering whether the Bible actually says it, it does. Deuteronomy 24, if you go a little further down, it says, once this article of divorce has been put into her hand, and once she has been sent out of the house, she may go and become another man's wife. It's clear. It's in the Bible. It's an article of divorce. They wrote it in 12 lines because they said it made it legal because there's like 12 different spaces in between all the books of the Bible. Oh, God. Justification upon justification. Yeah. And so Jesus says, nonsense. This is nuts. Listen, you've heard it said. You've heard it said. Anyone who divorces his wife gives her a certificate of divorce. That's all you need? A certificate of divorce? No! No, I'm telling you this, that the only grounds that you ever have for divorce, and by the way, he is holding with the Shammai camp, the only grounds for a divorce, and writing this article in which she can't remarry because she's going to be put to death, according to the law, so the only thing that would warrant this is sexual immorality. That's it. Marriage is permanent. So, to understand this, you need to understand Jesus' teaching about the marriage covenant. How many people know Jesus knows what he's talking about? You'll come to that conclusion. So, he was asked point blank about this Hillel interpretation. The Pharisees came to him and tested him, asking him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That's the Hillel position, pretty much any cause. Is that lawful? We've been doing it. Hillel's kind of talked about it. We've been doing this. Is this right? And here's Jesus' teaching, very clear, very succinct. He said, you've answered. He says, have you not read that he created them from the beginning? He made them male and female. And then he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and they shall hold fast to his wife. And here's the key phrase here. The two shall what? Become one flesh. Then he says, there is no longer two. There's only one. And by the way, this is why we here at this church, we honor the wives as leadership. So we have elders, deacons, and wives because they are one. They are one flesh. They are no longer two, but they are one. And then he says, therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. You can't separate this. I don't care how many halals, I don't care how many articles of divorce, I don't care how many things. They're one flesh and nothing can separate it. Now here's my question for you. What makes marriage permanent? What makes two people become one? If you go back and study the marriage covenant, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, it's all about the sexual union in marriage. It's all about when somebody sexually comes together with another human being and they become physically one and spiritually one. The sexual relationship is actually a sealing of the covenant of marriage. In the case of Jacob and Leah, it was regardless of a ceremony. Now, that does not mean that if you have sex with something, you're automatically married. That does not mean that. But what it does mean is before God is once you've made these vows and once you've sealed it with that act, it's done. We no longer have two people here. We have one person. How strong was this teaching? If you go to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, where the Corinth church was all about promiscuity and fleshly behaviors and visiting prostitutes, just like the Romans and Greeks did. Here's what he says. He says, this is Paul, do you not know that he who joins with a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two will become one flesh. When you go into that prostitute, what's happening there is two people are, whoa. That's how big of a deal this sexual interaction is to God. But I have to say as a precaution, because this is the way we do it today, the marriage is formed by vows and commitments made beforehand, and then marriage consummates the sexual union. But you need to know that this consummation of sexual union is such a big deal to God that he no longer sees two people but one. And what is a child? Two people becoming one. So Jesus here is dealing with the root cause of this sin of adultery, which is men looking around and thinking that who's going to be my next wife? I got this liberty. So it says, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one member than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And then he says the same thing again. He says, if your right hand causes you to sin. And right now we have to talk about literary context. Because how many people know that you can pluck out one eye and still lust? As a matter of fact, you could pluck out two eyes and still lust. You can cut off both hands and still lust. So Jesus is not talking about your literal eye or your literal hand. Always in the Bible, there's a spiritual connotation to an eye, and the eye is a symbol of desire and want. Peter talked about this in his epistle when he talks about these false teachers who have eyes full of idolatry. They're looking with lust. So there is a lustful look in the eye that needs to be dealt with. What is the hand symbol of? Well, it's always a symbol of action or achieving or getting what you want. God, by his right hand, does mighty things. We, with our hands, do works to receive rewards. So the eye sees it, the hand acts on it. That's the way it works. Your eye and your hand are the problem. Scandalon is the Greek word that is used for causes you to sin. And what this means is that there is something, the word scandalon is a stumbling block or something that traps you like an animal is trapped or lured to destruction. You're being enticed by a bait that is eventually going to lead to your destruction. So the word scandalon eventually became known as anything that causes a person's destruction. But it usually starts with bait. It starts with something that you see with your eye. Here's a fish. Here's a lure. This lure is his demise. How does the whole thing happen? He sees it. He then starts swimming to it. That is the eye. The swimming is the hand and the action. The eye sees, and then there's the action of swimming toward it. And what happens after this? Well, yeah, the rest is history. Most likely, you're going to end up on a grill. Your destruction began with you seeing that stupid lure and then swimming toward it. This ends up this way because of the eye and the desire and then the swim. Think David and Bathsheba. In 4 simple verses, his entire ministry as king crumbles. It's simple. It is 4 verses. In the spring of the year, when kings went out to battle, he's home daydreaming. He should have been at war, but he's not. He's got too much time on his hands. Look, he sees the woman bathing on the roof. Then he acts. He sends for the inquiry. And by verse 4, he has taken her and has slept with her. 4 verses. I see, I want, I act, it's done. That's what Jesus is getting at. Seeing and coveting starts it. Then there's the action, the planning, the fantasizing, the how is this going to happen? And then finally, there's the fulfillment. Jesus says, why don't you deal with the coveting first? Why don't you stop right there? Why don't you link these 2 commandments together and then be content with what you have and stop looking around for something better? Doesn't it all start by being discontent and looking for something better? If a man is totally content with his wife, if he believes that's his only source of love, then he's just going to settle and say, yes, this is it. To death do we part. But if he thinks there's something better that he could get out of this, yes, he's going to start looking around. So now we get to perhaps the most twisted part of these verses that have been more mangled and abused and misunderstood because they're not kept in the context. And that is the subject of divorce, remarriage, when it is allowed and when it is sinful. What Jesus is saying here is, because of this stupid article of divorce, if you can't give this unless she has been unfaithful, because the unfaithfulness is the only thing that breaks the covenant, if you send her away for any other cause, what's going to happen is you're going to make her a victim of adultery. And the person who marries her, he's going to commit adultery. They're both going to commit adultery. And by the way, you're going to commit it. You're going to have 3 acts of adultery because you sent her away through this stupid article of divorce that you had no grounds. So here's the way it works. You come to your wife one day, you give her the articles, you serve her the articles, but the covenant is never broken. She's never been unfaithful. You're just giving her this article thinking you can move on. You're still one flesh. That has not been broken by her or by you or anything. So now she's going to think she's free to marry. As soon as she does, she commits adultery. And by the way, the person who marries her, he too is going to commit adultery. That's the way that's the context. Now here's what I have to say about this. And this is where the misunderstanding is. She commits the act of adultery, but she's not going to be living in adultery. Do you understand that? Because the idea is that once you remarry a divorced woman, that somehow you're going to be living with, living in adultery with. No. Adultery is a one-time thing that you do. And there's a really, really good study Bible that was written by some of the greatest scholars on the planet. It's the NIV Study Bible. If you have a copy, you can go there and read this. But it simply explains a second marriage, though it begins with adultery, is still a marriage. Once a second marriage has occurred, it would be a further sin to break it up. The second marriage should not be thought as a continual living in adultery, for the man and woman are now married. Why? Because they've come together, they've committed the act of adultery, but now they're actually married. And they are married to each other and not to anybody else. Do you understand how that works? Jesus is emphasizing that this stupid document is not legitimate, and here's what you're causing. And by the way, just to be clear, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says a husband who divorces her first may not remarry her. So once you've broken that through a sexual act, it cannot be just ignored. So, the covenant of marriage is permanent. But here's what I have to get really to as we get really specific. The covenant of marriage according to God is permanent unless, and these are the reasons for divorce. If you ever wonder, what does the Bible permit as far as getting a divorce? Here they are. I already said it. Infidelity or breaking the marriage covenant by being sexually unfaithful. That does not mean that if your spouse has broken the covenant and has been unfaithful, you immediately have to divorce him. Restoration is a possibility. As a matter of fact, it might be the highest that you try to restore. But here's my point. Once it's broken, it has to be restored. It's broken, it needs to be restored. You can restore it, but you don't have to. You can let it be broken. That's the permission. Somebody breaks the marital covenant, it's broken. You can restore it, but you don't have to because it is broken. And the other one I have to mention here is desertion and abandonment, because the Apostle Paul talks about it. He talks about an unbelieving person who is married to you leaving, and he says the brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. The idea of being bound is that marriage is not binding anymore because God has called us to peace. So, 2 reasons, only 2, biblically given for divorce. Anything else is not legitimate. Somebody says, well, what about physical abuse or emotional abuse or sexual abuse? No. Ooh, what? Bible doesn't actually allow for any of that. But here's what it does clearly teach over and over, is you don't have to live with this guy or this woman. There's grounds for separation. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Obviously, if you separate from somebody who is physically, emotionally, or sexually abusive, and you separate long enough, there's a really good chance he's going to move on. And he's going to break the marital covenant anyway by being with somebody else, and therefore you then would be free to remarry. And that's, in most cases, probably realistically how it comes down. So, those are the reasons for divorce or separation. What are the biblical permissions for remarriage? Obviously, clearly, biblically taught, if a person has been divorced for the sexual infidelity reasons, obviously that marriage has been terminated and they are free to marry anybody. That marriage is broken, they're free to marry. I even read it to you in Leviticus. If it was broken sexually, they are free to remarry. That was what the article of divorce said. That's what Jesus announced. He even said you can divorce a person for this reason, meaning that they could also remarry. The other reason, permission to remarry, would be somebody who has been deserted or abandoned, and of course the death of a spouse. A wife, and there's the same word bound, that's how we know that it's releasing a person if the person abandons them, the same word. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but her husband dies, she is free to be married to whoever she wishes. That is what Jesus was getting at. The sanctity of the marriage cannot be broken for frivolous reasons. It's permanent. The sexual act makes 2 people one, and the only thing that can break that oneness is a violation with another sexual act, or that person abandoning, leaving, and thereby making it impossible for that bond to continue.
Thanks for listening to this message from River Mountain Church. If you'd like some more information, visit our website, rivermountainchurch.org.